So we're going to be talking about recommendation systems. What are recommendation systems? So this is amongst the most sort of popular. There are entire conferences which are based on recommendation system and designing recommendation systems. So to some extent, what you're doing with PageRank is an example of a recommendation system. It's recommending some web pages from a large collection of pages that exist that match your search criteria. And you can imagine that in the scheme of sort of a lot of these web applications, and whenever we deal with this online behavior, recommendation systems become important. And I sort of have mentioned this earlier as well, but I'll sort of formally define it. What happens is that consider two examples which I'll sort of repeatedly go back to during this lecture, which is consider a website like Amazon and consider somebody like Netflix, okay? And try to think in terms of, 10, 15 years ago when these were not out there. So think of what you see at Walmart as a comparison to what happens at Amazon, and consider maybe Blockbuster as it used to exist as a competitor to Netflix, right? So think in terms of what you had in your physical stores or services. And you can think of other examples that exist a little bit. Think in terms of the analogy, right? So what was the case? So what was the problem when you go to a physical store? What is the problem when you go to Walmart or when you go to Blockbuster and you want to buy something or to look for, to want to rent out a movie? What is the strategy that these people use? So you walk into it.
Blockbuster, like by genre, like let's say you go to Blockbuster, like as far as for helping someone find the thing they want?
No, so there are two separate issues, right? So think from the perspective of, so let's take one step back. You're right, that is an easy case. It's always easy when you are looking for a specific movie. Okay, let's stick to movies for the time being. You're looking for a specific movie, right? Or what does Walmart want to do when you walk into the store? Maybe you walk in there to buy milk, but they want you to buy more than that.
So the back.
No, they put the milk in the back, yes. But what do they do besides that? They depending on what they think people might be interested in, they set up special displays. This is what Blockbuster used to do, right? You walk in and there are these special movies out there trying to grab your attention that you might have come to pick up one movie, or maybe your kids suddenly see, there's a new Disney movie and I want to rent that one out as well, right? So the goal, of course, is it's easy if everybody only is such a controlled buyer or a user of the service that I already know what I want to watch or I want to buy, and that's the only thing I'm going to do, right? But most of these stores or services want you to use whatever they're offering as much as possible, because that's how they make more money, right? So that is the case. So what has happened traditionally, and so this is the distribution. There is going to be a set of movies which are going to be very popular. There's going to be a set of items which most people are going to be buying, milk, toothpaste, whatever, general stuff. But then there is a much, much longer list of random items. This is the kind of stuff that you buy off Amazon or eBay, because Walmart is not going to carry it, right? There's a huge list of items, right? Maybe you want some bizarre toothpaste, you don't want Colgate, you want some herbal toothpaste or anything else that is not as popular. Walmart has no interest because maybe they sell 2 tubes a year, right? So what has happened is that the physical stores, since they're limited by their resources. It's not a massive warehouse which goes on forever, and there is a cost of storing such items. It's not tailored to individual users, right? And that's what it is. So what you do is that you look at aggregate numbers. Which products sell most? What products am I likely? So I'll have to sort of consider, let's say I'm offering a lecture here, I would have to tailor it for the demands of, as I see students at the University of Utah. Who's interested in what kind of topics. Again, you can extend it, I can just churn out 20 different courses for anybody who's interested if I'm doing it online, right? And you can pick and choose. So there's always been this issue between what can be offered in a physical store versus what can be offered in an online sense. But what is the problem with the online store then? How do you decide now? You need to figure out what to show. In a physical store, it's there. I have a new hit, I have a certain movie that I think people in this local area are going to watch. I'm going to put that up front. Halloween is coming, let me stack up with candy. You know, that's the dominant thing, or maybe costumes, whatever. You know, you start showing it up front. That's what you show on display. The question now is that physical stores don't have this option, but online stores do, which is that if you log on, then I know what to offer. So I'm not going to show him rails, right? Because that's not relevant in this case. So nobody got it, so it's okay. But the question is, how do you actually determine what is it that a particular user is interested in, right? So your tastes are going to be somewhat here as well. So there are certain items, certain popular items that an odd user is interested in. So you know, you have the next Bond movie, maybe everybody's interested in watching that. But you might be interested in very specific movies from an odd genre, and that might be out here. So how does Netflix know that this is what you're interested in? Let me show you what you should watch, or you might be interested in, right?
Like your account history and stuff like.
Yes. So the question here is that how do you actually do this, right? So a recommendation system broadly is going to be designed to do this. You can think of it from two separate angles here, right? The users and the items, right? So you have a large collection of users and you have a large collection of items. And items could be movies or products that Amazon is selling, or any extension to a comparable business model. And what we're interested in now is, can I predict what items you're going to like? And correspondingly, maybe can I predict, here's a new item that I have, can I predict which users are going to be most likely interested in this? So think of somebody like Amazon, where you get a new product, you want to make sure that it's offered to a set of early users so that reviews are in, ratings are there, and so people can start looking at it and buying it, right? So they're all sort of somewhat related problems. And now we're going to look at how do you take a problem in this category, what are the numerical systems that we have to use, how do we pose it mathematically, and what is it? So what do you think this problem is like, mathematically? Consider the two examples that I gave. What is the order of, let's say, how many users do you think, or buyers are there on Amazon? Order of millions, easily, right? Yeah. Easily millions. Number of items? Billions, right? Easily, right? What we want to do again, not a big surprise that everything is going to boil down to a matrix. So when we were doing PageRank, we talked about this transition matrix. We're computing probability. Here we're computing basically a utility matrix. And this can have a few different connotations depending on the sort of the specific problem or the specific thing that we're trying to recommend. But basically, think of it like we have a bunch of users in the row and we have the items in the columns, right? So each of them, what are you going to be measuring? So maybe it can be Boolean, it can be an ordered set, it can be a real number. What do I mean by that? Boolean is, have you watched this movie or have you not watched this movie, right? Or have you bought this item, have you not bought this item? Have you visited this page, have you not visited this page? So that's a simple case. You could have an ordered set. So on movies, at least for those of you who've been using Netflix for a long enough time, where Netflix wanted you to go and rate movies that you've seen, right? Or Amazon is asking you to rate, is giving you incentives to rate, products that you've bought. That's what it is. Why is Amazon so interested in you adding things to the wish list? It goes actually a little bit beyond just simply having it ready for you that you might purchase it later. It tells them more about what things you're interested in buying, okay? So that they can target it and show you things that are there. It can also be a real number, so you can give a much more you can convert some of these or have an expression of how much you like something or how much you would be interested. The key factor, and it's a very, very big factor, because remember what we just discussed, that this matrix is huge, right? It's really, really big, right? You have a million by a billion matrix, and it is sparse, okay? But it's a special kind of a sparse. Who can tell me why this is a special kind of a sparse? This is not the same kind of a sparsity we saw with the PageRank case. Think about this, because if you understand this, everything else should be relatively clear. What is different? First of all, is it sparse or not?
Yes.
Okay. And how is this sparsity different from what we saw in the matrix, the transition matrix case?
Is it just about how sparse it is? Like, is this going to be extremely sparse?
They're both, let's say they're both extremely sparse. So let's recollect. Why was the transition matrix sparse?
Because not every page is linked to every other page.
Yes. Why is this one sparse?
Because the product may not be used more than a few consumers.
Yes. So you have probably watched. Let's maybe go to the movie example. You've probably watched, 10 movies, 100 movies, 1,000 movies. There might be some, loser sitting somewhere on his couch who's probably watched most things on Netflix, but that's not your average case, right? So there might be people who have similarly bought every single item, or not every single item, but a large number of items on Amazon.
So I think maybe the distribution, like for some products, the utility might be far more, and by far more users.
No, but this is true for the transition matrix as well, right?
Right.
You could have somebody who's just curating websites or links, and he has this one web page which links to a gazillion others, and similarly, people might be linking to a particular news article or New York Times or some other popular website a million times, right? So that structure generally exists. Think just one step beyond. So up to now, whatever we discussed, these are very similar, right? Their structure. I'm not talking about the contents. I'm only looking at the pattern. So for those of you who might have used MATLAB, this is your SPY command, just showing you the structure. Is showing you where the non-zeros are. Has anybody used SPY? You should. If you use it. So it just tells you what the structure is. Okay. But what else is different here? What about the places where we do not have entries? So if I have a zero somewhere or an entry, if I don't have an entry in my transition matrix, what does that mean?
So maybe the customer has used the product but not rated.
Maybe. Elaborate on that. What is the more likely case? So let's go back to the PageRank case. Transition matrix. If I have a zero somewhere, if I don't have an entry, right? You are creating this matrix, so you should now start thinking in terms of how you move from your data, the links to the page, right? So
here it might mean like the customer doesn't like the product, so the data matters.
You're again being more specific than you need to be. The answer is that we don't know.
Okay.
It's not that it is zero. It's not that the link does not exist.
It might.
We just don't have the information. It is really, in essence, it's a dense matrix, right? It's just that the information we have is sparse. In the PageRank case, the information we have is absolute. It's just that link does not exist. In this case, I don't know. You might not have watched a particular movie, or you might not have bought a particular item, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a preference for this item, right? So as far as Amazon or Netflix is concerned, it is a question mark rather than a zero, right? So that is what it is. So if somebody of you have read this, actually, this is the goal. This is basically the goal of our problem. So we have an incomplete matrix and we want to complete it. Fundamentally, that's the problem. And that's why it's different from what we have done so far, right? So we want to predict the blank entries of this matrix. So we have some values can we predict the rest? Which logically should make somewhat sense. You know, you liked the last 2 Bond movies, you're going to like the next one, right? You like fantasy movies, let me recommend that you watch Lord of the Rings, whatever, right? So, of course, you have to be very careful when you're trying to do something like this, especially if you're not doing it on toy problems. It's not necessary, and in general, it's not possible to predict every entry. You know, you're talking of a million by million, millions by billions matrix. This is really huge. Amazon or Google, even these companies can't really store such a large matrix, right? This is just too big. So, but what are we interested in? And this sort of you should have an idea of this based on our previous lectures. We only want to predict certain high values. So this is equivalent to what we were saying earlier, that we just want to predict a few of the most frequent items or the most likely items. Netflix is interested in what are the 100 most likely movies that this person is interested in, right? That is what our goal is. Or Amazon is interested, like when you show up, what is it that this person is looking for or looking to buy? Can I offer them with a nice deal? And here, go ahead and let's buy it, right? Amazon actually did this to me. Like personally, no. So it was like I was sort of on the fence thinking of whether I should buy the new Kindle. Should I buy the new Kindle? And then suddenly it shows up and it's like, new Kindle, $50 off, basically. And I was like, okay. And then I realized that it wasn't actually, it was a special offer given only to me or to a small set of people, right? Because they're like, here's a person that will buy it or he's on the fence, let me make sure that this guy buys this product. So, again, I know this because that offer, because I told him, I'm like, Amazon is really cheap. The new Paperwhite is really cheap today. And he's like, I don't see it. But understand, right? This is what you want to be able to do. You have so much data. So effectively, they got some money out of me, right? Maybe not the total amount of money, but they did manage to sell me an item. And again, those kind of products is easy because you're still consuming, you're buying books beyond that and so on. So there is an incentive to subsidize this. But that's basically what you're trying to do. You have this information, can we do this, right? So how should you actually predict some of these values? So we are now going to we're slowly going to move on to the numerical side. But again, this is a very generic problem, which is sort of ubiquitous in this large space. And so that's the reason why it's such a hot topic of research. Like I said, you have entire conferences focused on this. The basics. How do you start? How do you create this matrix? Right? This is where this is not as well defined as our PageRank case, so it's hard to get this information. So here are the options. You can obviously ask users to rate the items. What are the downsides? Not everybody wants to rate, right? You really cannot. I mean, occasionally, and not just that, you might spend, like maybe it's a news service or on the odd day, like let me go and rank a few movies that I really like. You're not going to do it on a regular basis. So even within users who are kind of willing to do it, it's not complete. Secondly, there's a huge bias. You might be in a good mood and you might just say like, 5 points for this movie. And on a different occasion, you might be like, this wasn't that great. Right now, some of you might have experienced this, like, I can't believe I rated that as a 4 or a 5, right? So the information is very, very noisy here, which makes it very difficult. The other thing, of course, is that maybe you don't want to rely on the human input here, which is that you get the systems to automatically make these interpretations of whether you liked it or not. Right? I can give you, towards the end of the lecture, I tell you what really happened, because Netflix has been doing this for a very, very long time, and I have a lot of friends who work in Netflix, so I know how their strategies have changed over the years. So the other thing is, of course, Boolean choice, right? Which is easier in some sense, or at least not as susceptible to noise or a bias, which is that do you like it or not? So as long as you gave something a rating of 3 or more, I take that as a 1, likes it. You give me a rating of 0, 1 or 2, that's a fail, that's a 0. So let's looking at this matrix only as zeros and ones. Whether you watched something or whether you bought something, or maybe even if you just visited that page, right? You can think of course, expanding this. We're not going to cover this, but in terms of sort of completeness, something that you should think about. You can think of what Amazon would ideally want to do is to decompose this into 2 separate problems. Is it a page that you watched or you saw and spent some time on, which means that you might be interested? And the second step, if you were exposed to this product, did you actually buy it, right? So you can sort of look at it as a slightly more complicated problem. You also want to understand here that large corporations like Google and Amazon have a huge advantage. The reason why Netflix is so much more successful, even in the online arena, compared to other people who have sort of tried to enter it, is that they just have so much more information. Right? There's already an advantage that Amazon has in terms of really offering you the kind of products. They have so much knowledge about the kind of items that you are interested in that they're able to push forward a lot more items than a regular store would be. This is where sort of Walmart became so much popular compared to your small mom and pop shops, right? It's just the amount of choice that you have. That the kind of random things that you buy just ends up being so much higher in these kind of places compared to let's say a small shop where you went in and picked up only what you wanted. And so most of these things are purely tailored at that. Nobody is really bothered, especially in the online scenario, for things that you can search for. Because you will search for it, you'll find it, you'll watch it. There's no extra business there. All of these systems are geared towards getting you to buy things or watch things that you wouldn't have done on your own, right? So that's the focus. So anytime you have this information which is related to your taste or information about what kind of people like this particular product or a movie, is where the sort of money is there to be made. Okay? And of course, the quality of the utility matrix, right? The kind of information that you have. Like I said, we basically don't have a lot of information, but whatever little information you have and the quality of that really determines what you're going to be. So think about what you would do. So if you are not Amazon, if you are a small dedicated shop, right? You're a small vendor selling very specialized goods. What sort of a strategy would you really use? Would it be the same as what Amazon would do, or would you go for something else? So think about it. We're going to get into that. Here are the 2 major approaches that people take, and this is really decided by what you're selling and what level of information you have. The first one, this has sort of historically been the case for most vendors, which is content-based systems. So effectively, try to look at similarity of items, right? So in case of, say, music or movies, this is easy. Try to categorize your content or the product that you're selling. So, genre, director, the kind of actors, which era it's based on, sci-fi, fantasy, whatever, those kind of things. And based on this, try to recommend. So what you're trying to do is that you're trying to identify, you're classifying or you're tagging each of your items, and then you're trying to figure out each of your users or end consumer, which of these do they favor. And so if you like sci-fi movies, and a new sci-fi movie comes, here you go. Look at this. This is very simple. There's not that much happening here, because what is it that we need to do this? What are the prerequisites for designing this sort of a recommendation system? What do I need?
Just need a history.
Start with simple things. I need to be able to somebody has to sit down, either manually or in a semi-automated fashion, what are these things?
Properties of movies. and-
Yeah, the actual properties, or it's similar to what we defined earlier as a feature,
Feature,
right?
right.
Yeah. So you're trying to identify what should this feature be, right? And this can be, like I said, manual or semi-automated as well. What else do I need? It's again the same as what we did earlier, so you should know what the second piece is. How do we compute similarity?
The rating of the customer.
No, there's no rating here. There is no rating here. I don't. So this is basically you're working towards information that is known in a, let's say, relatively more absolute fashion, right? There is a clear way of categorizing it, and then I just need a similarity metric. Can I determine if two movies are similar based on these tags, or based on your histories? Can I figure out? So what would I do? I would look at the movies you have watched, the tags of each of those movies, and try to characterize what set of, which actors, which genres, which directors are you leaning towards, right? So based on the feature vector, and remember, it's very important here to know that I am using the same feature vector for both the item as well as for the user. Is that clear? Yes or no? Right? So my feature vector would be, let's say, this set of tags, correct? Maybe a weight associated with each of those tags, but fundamentally it's still the same. So I can compare an item to a user, I can compare two users, I can compare two items, right? That's the convenience. So if you're going for a small scale, if you don't have too much prior history, you're just starting off, this is where you're going to start, because there is no other prerequisite. Right? It's not biased by my data at all. Right? The second is collaborative filtering. Most of your large scale vendors opt or go in this direction, right? Why? So what it tries to do is that it doesn't. So what is the problem in the first approach? You still have to decompose this, right? So if you're looking at all the products that Amazon sells, it's a mess. This feature vector keeps growing. You have to decide. Somebody has to manually go and tweak it. You get a random junk item that you probably see quite often on Amazon. Who decides how this gets broken down? What is this feature vector, right? And of course, this keeps growing with the number of items that you have. Collaborative filtering takes a different approach. There is no, well, in some sense, there is a feature vector, but the feature vector is very different. You use your data directly. So what you're interested in doing is that the goal, at least, and we'll talk about how they do it, is that you want to find another user who has similar taste as you, watches the same kind of movies, or buys the same kind of products. And then you can use items that this particular other similar user has used and recommend it to you, and the other way around. So if you can find a pool of similar users, the moment one of them buys it, it can be propagated onto other people, right? And so it can diffuse out to all your users depending on what their tastes are and where the overlaps are, right? So this is easy. It's also easy in the other sense, right? So a new user comes in. Very soon you can find out which other users are similar to it, send it across. Or new item comes in, find items which are similar to this. You already have an existing base of people who are likely to buy this. Okay? So what is the downside? It's actually related to the same advantages that I talked about now. When a new user comes in or a new item comes in, you don't have enough information. So you have to put extra effort to build this thing. This is sort of the cold start problem. What do you do? Because I'm a new user, I haven't bought anything yet. So how do you know what to recommend me besides the standard set of items? So there is a time before which the system can figure out what I like, or if I'm a new item, can figure out what kind of users like me.
So maybe based on highest probability, something that's popular, that's what you would start off with. So
there are strategies, and it sort of tends being a little bit ad hoc. The simplest strategies, of course, do nothing. Do what the physical store would do. You know, show it to a whole bunch of users. Show it to your sort of compulsive buyers, let's say. You know, people who buy a lot. Show it to them no matter what. Here's a new product, maybe you'll like it. And then let that percolate onto everything else, so you build it. Similarly, new user comes in, show him the most popular products. and then wait for a while before it. Or you can use a slightly more, you could use a sort of a combo approach. When a new item comes in or a new user joins in, try to get them to answer a question and figure out what their tastes are. So go for a content-based system and you don't have the information. And once you start having enough information, switch to a collaborative filtering approach. Okay. I might have said this, so I'm just going to quickly look at it to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So the content-based systems is basically you want to identify user item profiles and match them with a recommendation. Like I said, in some cases, and this is important, and depending on the particular kind of item that you're interested in selling, it might be easy. So for movies or audio, many of this information is already available, right? It's already tagged. You have information about the genre, so you already have a reasonable feature vector which is very reliable and has very low noise, right? So this information is there, and there you might want to actually use a content-based system. The second part becomes a little bit, so maybe that's why it's harder for somebody like Amazon to do it. You have some information, like, you know, the dimensions, the weight, the quantity, you know, but it's not as reliable. Just because you buy, I don't know, cookies in packs of hundreds, it doesn't mean that you're going to buy everything in the same. So it doesn't, the information doesn't translate the same way. And you can imagine that for other items, things like news articles, blogs, it's much, much harder because you really don't have this kind of information coming in a very immediate fashion. So how do you actually do this? Let's look at an example. Let's say that you are Google and you want to show advertisements. So based on the search terms, yes?
Can we give the weights, some weights to the feature vector elements?
Yes, you can. No, you can.
Yeah, based on the customer preference.
You can. So those would be hybrid systems. And it could also be a little bit more complicated, right? So what would end up happening more often than not is that, let's focus on music or movies for the time being. Each movie or each song will have a set of tags, right? Let's say all of it has a weight of 1. But as far as users are concerned, I can already sort of start building up a preference. This person likes rock music 60% of the time and classical 30% of the time and hip hop 10% of the time, whatever, right? So then you have a weighted average of those tags based on the user. On the item side, you probably want to still do it, unless, because that's what you can get automatically and very easily, right? So there always has to be a balance between how good is your data and how much extra effort would I have to do. So you could get a curator to go in and say that label each, you know, so you could have a music, a song which is, say, somewhat rock and somewhat pop, and then you really want to decide, but that's too difficult. It's much easier to just be much more inclusive and start relying on the information that you have accurately, which is that how often does a person listen to it.
Or can the weight be based on the other similar customers?
Yes, so that would end up being the collaborative filtering.
Yeah.
So typically a lot of these would do this. So when people like iTunes or something, so the more you're listening to it online, you might have noticed that progressively over the years, right, a lot of these places, you know, this Last FM, people are very interested in knowing what you're listening to or what you're watching. And it's mainly because then they have this information. It's less for your own sake than for them to actually be able to figure out what your interests are. So when you'll see some of these random features coming, you know, where they want to figure out, you know, yeah, tweet what song you're listening to, or, you know, I watched this, or, you know, Amazon is saying that tweet that I purchased this thing on Amazon. And some of you might have, I don't know how many of you have done it. Initially, I was like, why the heck does Amazon care? You know, if I tweet, I have no interest in tweeting that I just bought something. But they are much more, they're trying to do it because they want that information. Because that is a stronger feedback to them that you really like this product. It's not just that I bought it, but I'm willing to tweet and share it with everybody else, means that it's a strong reinforcement of the fact that you really like that this is something that you're passionate about. And so the more information in that direction that they get, the better it is for them, right? So be very wary of what information you're sharing with them, because that's what they're doing, using all of this for. So let's sort of look at this simple case, right? Just to sort of hammer in this idea. So when you search for something, right, the item profiles are going to be keywords and categories for ads. So you're somebody who's interested in advertising with Google, and so you would say that here are the categories, pizza, food, delivery, whatever, some keywords that you specify when you place this ad. And the equivalent user profiles are going to be whatever keywords that you searched for. Now in this case, is going to change with every single query. So when I talk about users and items, don't necessarily say that a user is going to be a physical person. In this case, the user might just be a single search query, right? So it's just a matter of us being able to connect these two, right? So this information might be much more dynamic than you imagine with the standard examples that we look at. It's always a matter of connecting the end consumer with whatever you're selling or whatever you're interested in offering. Okay? Sort of discuss this, that the user profile of what it is that the user is interested in buying is very, very important. And again, you might have looked at it, you have search keywords, your search history. That's why everybody gets into the browser game, right? Because they're really interested in having this knowledge about what you're visiting, what you're buying, and everything. You might have realized that a few years ago, when IE still sort of used to rule, all your major vendors, Yahoo, Google, everybody was selling these stupid search, or not selling, they were offering you these search toolbars. And this is basically what they were using it for. It was for collecting information. Nobody was really interested, like, yeah, the toolbar is going to improve my life or something. That's what it is. The same is true for surveys that you might fill out for freebies. That gets sold on to other companies for information. That's what it is. So you're getting freebies, or they're giving you incentives to share information about your own preferences. And this is so that they can then eventually figure out what is it that they're interested in. So when people are sort of getting into making free resources available to you, things like your Gmail account, a lot of the free software that you use, things that you post on Facebook, they're making money because they have this information now, or at least have a way of obtaining it directly or indirectly. So yeah, you can get it from blog posts, tweets. Your tweets are public knowledge, so you can try to filter it out. Your browsing history, we talked about this. Let's sort of go to the next stage now. So we have collected some of this information. How do you make recommendation? I talked about you want to be able to compute the similarity between these profiles that we have looked at, right? So you can use Jacquard, cosine, we've looked at these before, or any other metric. This might be very specific to whatever you're pegging, right? So if you're Netflix, then this might boil down to how I compare similarities, right? And at what level. You could also use some sort of a bucketing technique to find items, because items is much harder, right? How do you do it? This sort of goes back to this PageRank type case. I know that you like certain kind of items, but there's so many items. We talked about the users are in the millions and items are in the billions. So you might have to actually use some sort of a tree so that I can actually narrow it down to what it is. And again, there's a lot of work that goes on in classification algorithms. Using users rating, can we figure out what is it that you like? And again, try to predict ratings for all other items. I mentioned this again. This is just a formal reminder for you that instead of using profiles or a feature vector which is manually defined, I say that if you are a user, your feature vector is the list of all items that you've bought. And if you're an item, the feature vector for this item is the list of users who have bought this product. Does it make sense? So let's think about it, right? I don't want to explicitly, pick your example. Let's take Amazon, okay? Amazon doesn't want to explicitly define the list of features, even though Amazon has all these categories, automotive, movies, books, whatever. It doesn't want to use this, and it wants to be completely open about it. Any item, Amazon is ready to sell you anything, and anybody can come and buy it. So I need a way to compare to users. So the way I compare to users is so I need a feature vector. The feature vector for any user, say you, is this long list. Amazon has 1 billion products, and there is a 1 or 0 based on where you bought it, or whether you bought a product or not. That gives me this very high dimensional feature vector that I can compare, right? So I have characterized the feature vector for every user is the history of products that they have bought. Maybe you can make it not ones and zeros, maybe there's a count based on how many times you've bought it, right? And so now I have a feature vector that I can use to compare two users. Now let's look at the other side. I want to also be able to compare two items. So what do? Each item's feature vector is the list, or is a large vector which is of dimension the number of users that Amazon has, with a 1 or 0 based on whether this particular user has bought this product or not. So now I have a way of comparing. And this goes back to what we talked about in terms of our goals, that two items are similar if similar people have bought it, or the same kind of, mostly similar people have bought it. And two people are similar if they bought the same kind of items, right? So if you remember in terms of our utility matrix, what is the feature vector for a particular item? It's the column of the matrix. And for a user, it's the row of the user. That's it. That whole row or column gives me feature vectors that I'm interested in. Okay? And now again, you can reuse whatever similarity metrics you had in terms of Jacquard or cosine. Do you see how this extends to those metrics that we've looked at? So Jacquard would be that you two are similar if the common items that you have bought to the union of the items that you have bought is sufficiently high.
Use like the Hamming distance.
The Jacquard distance.
Oh.
The intersection was divided by the union.
Right, but could you use like the Hamming distance? You have two vectors.
You could. So the metric is going to really depend on, the similarity is going to depend a lot on what you're selling, what you're trying to compare, and how you want it to be. There is a strong bias, so you might have noticed that the list of, even we did a textbook similarity case. Using Jacquard and cosine will give you slightly different results, right? That's your choice, and then what they're representing is different, and that is something which gets much more closer to sort of the data analytics side and how you do it. We're going to get very quickly to what it means in terms of being able to compute this on a matrix that is this large. Okay? And so the recommendations are going to be very simple, right, in both cases. You find other users, look at what items they bought and recommend that. Or find a user who's bought this item and then find other users and recommend this item to. So you can go both ways based on this. What are the challenges as far as we are concerned? The sparsity obviously presents a very big challenge for us. We also have issues related to rounding off of data. So we have to consider in terms of what ratings we are using. We talked about bias, that we might have to say that I don't really trust 3, 4, or 5 as being sufficiently different, because all I can somewhat reliably factor in is 1 and 0s. I was on one of these NSF panels, and there was one of these committee members who had extremely detailed criticism of every single proposal, but he gave everything a rating of 4 or 5, which was really bad. Even like the movies that, or the grants that he did like were still rated 4, which doesn't mean anything. I was still very cautious about what I would rate as 4. Even grants I kind of like would maybe get a 3.5 or a 4 unless I really loved it, and then I'll give it a 5. So this is a big problem, right? Because now you're looking at billions of users, so look in terms of how critical they're going to be, right? And this is a big problem. So you want to sort of both round it off or use similarity measures which are insensitive to this. Remember, in the Jacquard case, we're only seeing if a word exists. There is no notion of how frequently it's used. So it doesn't have the same kind of a bias, right? Or you might have to normalize rating as well. So try to figure out what kind of ratings this user gives. So maybe you're a user who gives a lot of 4s and 5s, which means that I need to normalize it to treat your 4 as a bad rating and 5 as a good rating, right? So you want to subtract the average user rating from each rating, and you want to convert low ratings to negative numbers, okay? So basically center it effectively. And this is obviously useful for cosine distance much more than the other ones. So if you're using something like cosine, I really want to have a notion of, is it a positive rating, is it a negative rating, or is it a 0, which is unknown. This also helps for if you want to use, remember that we have a problem which is of the form where we have missing data. And the moment we convert it into an actual linear algebra problem, we can't have unknown values, we have to fill zeros with them. So centering it and creating some ratings which are positive and negative is actually going to be required for us to be able to solve this problem. So we got it. Okay. So of course, because we are running in such a large space, we can start clustering these together. So you can say that I will use a hybrid approach where I'm going to cluster my users into a bunch of categories, and I'm going to cluster all my items into a bunch of categories, which means that this large matrix that I had to estimate has become smaller. So from a millions by billions thing, maybe it gets into thousands by millions case, right? So you're clustering them. You're not clustering them to an extent that's there. And in some sense it makes sense, right? So yes, U2 might be different, but if we say that we have 1 billion users, do we really expect that all of these billion users have completely different tastes? No, right? And so that's where clustering helps. So there might be enough people that at the granularity at which we are willing to consider this, it might be fine for us to just cluster. So you can start clustering it, and the entry is basically just going to be the average rating that you have. And you can do this in a recursive fashion. So I can say that here is my full utility matrix, I coarsen it, then I coarsen it again, and then I coarsen it. So depending on how accurate I want to be, I can start getting approximations. And if I keep coarsening, this matrix is going to become dense at some point, right? So when we start off, we're going to have a very, very sparse matrix, or missing entries. As I start making it coarser and coarser, it's going to be fine enough. So between, say, all of us, there's a very high probability that we have watched a lot more movies on Netflix than any of us individually, right? So if we were to say that we form a single cluster, then our matrix starts to fill out quite a bit more. Okay? So of course, how do you actually use this? If you try to figure out when a new user comes or a new item comes, you want to find which cluster the user and the item belong to. And let's say these are C and D. So now you want to look in your coarsened, this clustered matrix for C and D and find out what its entry in the original matrix is, right? And of course, if it's possible that even in this clustered sense we don't have a very dense matrix, what we might have to do is to again find similar users or similar entries, similar items within this clustered matrix. Okay? Collaborative filtering. And we presented our problem as one of matrix factorization, which basically what we're saying is that we have this utility matrix M, which gives us this relationship between the users and the items and how they have been ranked, or an estimate of where they've been ranked. This matrix is sparse in a sense that a very large number of these entries are missing, right? We don't have any idea. And what we would like to do is to factorize it into two smaller matrices, U and V. They are both skinny matrices. So even though M is a very large n by n matrix, let's say both in the order of millions or billions, we would like to approximate it by these two matrices, U and V. And we talked, it's basically an outer product kind of an approximation, where if D was equal to 1, we looked at this example where U would be a vector n times 1, and V, if you want, you can represent it as V transpose, would be basically 1 times M. And the outer product basically gives us an estimate of the simplest estimate that we could have of the probability of you buying a particular product or being interested in the product, where the first one sort of approximated your chance of buying or how good a customer you were, and we sort of captured the same information from the product side or the item side of how likable or how popular this particular item was. Now, when we look at a problem like this, we sort of did start going down a particular direction, but I want you all to think of how do you want to really approach this problem. So in terms of what we have done, is there something that we can do in terms of doing this? What might be a possible approach to this problem? Possible, not necessarily completely correct, but I want you to think about it. So we have this matrix M, which we have only some values of, and we want to basically generate an approximation, right? So what problem does this look similar to? Well, least squares, yes, we're going to go in that direction. But in terms of what we've done in class, conceptually at least, it's close enough to the sketching problem, is it not? We want an approximation, we want a low rank approximation of a matrix M. Why is it that we cannot, or can we not apply what we have we did as part of sketching to this particular problem? Can we generate a sketch of matrix M? Forget this UV decomposition, just think of it. Would it work? First of all, is that if I had a sketch of M, is that going to be good enough? Think. Again, it's when you attend a class like this, it's not like whatever we cover in class is going to be directly applied to whatever problems you're going to face. You have to sort of think a little bit beyond it. Can I apply? These are the techniques that I've learned. Can I apply it here? The answer might be no, but I want you to think about it. Why do we need yet another method? Or are there alternate ways of doing this? What are the challenges? So look at from two perspectives. One, if I had a sketch, would it be useful? And second is, how would I compute a sketch?
The sketch itself is low dimensional.
Okay.
So, I mean,
the way we did it, and that's why I'm trying to sort of refresh your memories on other things as well. What was the equivalent problem in a sketch when we were considering sketch? If we had an n by m matrix, if m is n times m, then the sketch, let's call it x, would have been what?
subset.
In terms of what are the dimensions, what were we planning to do?
I times j where I is less than n and j is less than n.
Really? Were we doing that? What were we doing when we...
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It'll be I times n.
So-
I is less than-
It was sort of n cross d, right?
yeah, d.
So if I use the same notation out here. So it's a little bit more than what we were doing out here. We're just only generating the first part of it. So is that going to be enough? No, right? Or is it? What are we doing in terms of capturing this information? What would that look like if we were to do this?
More significant directions. That's what
Yes, but what? In terms of, where are we getting the compression, so to say? What are we reducing?
Well, the d, I mean.
Yes, so the number of items.
The number of items.
So you're sort of getting the compression in one dimension where you're basically saying that if I had a small set of users and I wanted to just compress the number of items into D categories, then that would work. Okay? So we could do it because we're only getting the compression as far as the number of columns is concerned. Okay? Just understand. Again, some of you might say that, I'm having an argument about a technique which cannot be applied, but you need to sort of think in terms of it. What is the other challenge? Let's say that maybe your use case scenario is where you only have 10,000 users. So that's fine, I have 10,000 users, I have a few billion products, right? Maybe you're doing this at the level of countries or states, Amazon trying to figure out across each state what is the demand for items, right? So there it would be fine because n would be much smaller, correct? What is the second challenge? So there I created a scenario where the technique or the method can be applied. What is the problem? How do you do it? Can you do it? Can you compute it? Let's take Amazon for an example, and let's consider that n is going to be states in the US. Okay, so Amazon is trying to figure out, so you might have read about it, Amazon tries to ship your product before you've even ordered it. What it's basically doing is to make sure that all the items that it sells are well distributed across. Walmart does this as well. So you want to make sure that the amount of items that you keep in its warehouses are proportional to the demand. Right? So maybe you want to do that out here. So what would that be? N would be the states, and this is items, and maybe I want to reduce it to some smaller category, right? So demand is somehow proportional to this. So can I use sketching in this case?
Yes, because n is small enough.
Yes. How would you compute it? Are there challenges to the algorithm? So the first part is yes. If I could sketch this matrix, then that would serve my purposes, right? The second part question is, are we in a position to sketch this matrix? Yes, no, why not? What is it? What were we doing when we were sketching a matrix?
Most frequent items, basically. So, for an item, whether or not it belongs, what's the demand in a particular state will be a row.
So what are the columns? What are the columns in this case? The items. The items, right?
And the rows are the demand.
The states in each of
Yeah,
them.
it's demand and
Yeah. So what am I doing? I'm going to bring in
the most frequent
guess
items in every state.
and what's the algorithm? I bring it in and then
Keep them.
somebody, please, from the back. You. What was the sketching algorithm like?
The SVD thing that we used?
Yes. What was it? So what did we do? Forget this thing. What about again somebody from the back? What about the frequent items? Not forget sketching. Just if we were just doing counts, maybe let's boil it down to just all of America. Amazon is just interested in figuring out what the demand of each of these is. So what are the most popular items in the US? How would we change that?
So we are calculating the dominant directions by getting the eigenvectors and then by updating the matrix by multiplying by that sigma matrix.
Yes, but fundamentally what are we doing? We are bringing in a few columns or a few items. We are computing, this is the sketching part again, we have gone back to sketching. In the items part, what we were doing was that every time our whatever buffer, that whatever amount of memory that we could keep, we were zeroing it out, zeroing out the lower half, bringing in new and updating it every time. In the matrix sense, because we had to sort of reduce the effect of whatever data we are discarding, we had to compute the eigenvectors, basically do a decomposition, zero out the lower half, and take the spectral norm of the median column and subtract that from all the other ones. So we were doing that repeatedly. Is there a problem in doing this? For this particular data set, so now the method is there, the method kind of works, we know, we have all our bounds. Is there a problem in applying it to this problem?
The demand may be different for different items in each state, so some states might have influence on the items that we arrive at in the end.
How does that affect us? Why does that affect us?
So the approximation might not be big enough in that case.
Why?
So the row for one state might not be good enough if we complete, because we are ultimately reducing it to D.
Yeah, so what are we doing there? We are just saying that D need not be the whole scope. You're just saying that there is some smaller number of categories of items. So maybe it's loosely like diapers, right? Maybe it's diaper, it's actual products, maybe it's different. Maybe it's like, Pampers or whatever company manufactures Pampers is the one which is representing one particular category. These are very popular on the West Coast, these are not popular on the East Coast, or whatever some distribution across the states. You don't know that, right? What you're going to do in this case by computing this is to figure out how they cluster together, right? The items, the M items that we had, how they cluster together. There's only one thing that you should be aware, the case where it might fail, or it might not work well enough in terms of doing a sketching as opposed to what we are trying to do out here. What is the difference? I can write there as well, sorry. So, what is the problem? Between what is the one extra assumption that we have, or one additional situation we have in this problem as opposed to when we were sketching?
That we're completely aware of the demands.
Or,
Like
now
but
let's
they're
go
just-
mathematically. I've been giving you examples, but mathematically what does it mean? M is incomplete. We don't have our full columns. What do you think though? I want you to at least have an intuitive feel for this. What do you think? How is it going to perform? If let's say this is a problem in question, and instead of actually solving for U and V, I actually computed a sketch. For this specific problem, let's say. So we're sort of trying to bring in the specific problem that we're trying to solve and the mathematical techniques that we have. Do you think it's going to work or is it not going to work?
If it's incomplete and you bring it in with zeros at the incomplete locations,
Yes.
then you're going to have a bad estimate of the D vectors that should be in the matrix.
Yes.
Because there might be high demand for some other item and then it's not there in your set.
Yes. So, but what do you think? If I compute it, is it going to be completely wrong? Is it going to be an approximation?
It's an approximation
Yes.
subject to the error bounds that you have.
Yes.
But then again, those error bounds don't matter here because it's an incomplete model.
It is, exactly. So our bounds are not correct, but it's actually not too bad even in this case, especially if we group together. So for the original problem where we had all sorts of users and not just states, there it was really, really sparse. Now when we sort of start grouping together, our information becomes denser as well. We don't have as many, let's say, zeros or unknown entries in this case, so it would actually not be a bad problem. Okay? So the reason why I'm sort of digressing is that please, this is, we'll cover new material here, but please refresh the material, understand why we are looking at one of these methods, and also think in terms of what kind of problem. So maybe I'm going to give you a problem in your exam, which is going to be like, you're Amazon and this is your situation, how will you actually compute this? So think about not just the method in its very simple black box form, but or where it is traditionally applied. You might have to think a little bit outside the box and say that here is a technique that I learned and that is the one which is most relevant to this particular problem at hand. So always think in terms of what these methods are. Don't just be very one-dimensional that here is a problem and this is the way to solve it. Okay? So now let's look at it. So somebody mentioned least squares. So we want to solve something like this. We want to take our matrix M, right? And we want to write it as a product of two small matrices. First of all, does this make sense? Is this a good idea? When is it a good idea? Is it always a good idea?
D is large.
Is it a good idea when D is large? Let's think about it for a minute. What is the size of N? Let's assume that we have all the data. Okay? What is the storage space of N?
And by
What is the storage space in this scenario?
ND plus MD gives
Right? Am I right? Yeah. Right? So, what is this tell you? Is this, so where should I opt for, just from a memory perspective? This is big data. One of the issues is going to be of storage, right? We said that n times m is million times billion. You don't want to store such a large matrix. So the first one of the simplest thing, and this will also affect us because eventually you're going to be optimizing for these values. So when should you?
It's less than an m.
Right? So ideally maybe much larger than, right? So what should D be in some sense?
Smaller than n or m.
So yeah, D is, let's actually make it simple, right? Let's make it an inequality in this sense. So D is less than or equal to nm by n plus m. Okay? So anybody care to sort of intuitively guess what this indicates to you? Think of the usual problem that we talked about. What was n? Users? M is items. And so what do you want to do in this case? Let's simplify it a little bit. Let's sort of say that this is the case, right? So, or an alternate way of doing this would be that D is less than or equal to the minimum of m comma n. And ideally, you want, this is a very hard problem, right? This is the situation where it makes sense. We looked at this again. Where did this come out? We looked at something very similar. We talked about this when we looked at sketching as well, right? Why? Because what is this? This is an upper bound for the rank of n. So you, again, the same logic will come up. But in an ideal scenario, you really want this to be much, much, much smaller, right? So you're looking at it, and I talked about an intuitive feed for it, where D is sort of the number of categories that you're talking about. We looked at when D was 1 and what it meant. So what we're going to do is to solve this, right? But let's say the first part, before we start to sort of solve a problem like this, we want to figure out how do we actually measure if UV is close to M, right? So it's not that we are eventually going to solve M equal to UV. We're going to get some approximation to M, which is given by UV, right? So what the answer is there, but please try to understand. You want some measure of how close M is to UV. And for a minute, forget the mathematics of this, and let's get back to our original problem. We want to get these ratings, right? So what would be a good measure of whether whatever is predicted by U times V is a good estimate for a value of M? Let's say that we have U and V. How are you going to predict a value? Let's say that you have magically solved this problem and you log on to a website and I want to predict a particular, let's say simple case first. Let's say that I want a value Mij. Okay? This is the rating, the predicted rating for user I and item J. What is this? What would this be given by? How would you compute this? These are very basic questions, so please answers. It's not that complicated. What is this?
Row and J.
Yeah, so
Row and column multiplication of U. I and J column.
right?
Yeah.
So this, right? Again, you can either do this or you can do this. Right? Is this clear to everybody? So we can just take the corresponding row and column and multiply this. And again, if you remember what we talked about yesterday, the previous lecture, where I said where K was 1 or D was 1, it's the same thing that we were doing. Take this, multiply it by the other one, and that gives you. Okay? So this is this clear? So this is very simple, right? We can compute it. Maybe you want to do the alternate problem. Let's say that you are user I, and I want to recommend the top 10 items. I want to figure out how to populate this web page when you open up Amazon.com, right? Then what is it? What would I need to do in that case? What is it that I'm interested in? So we have user I, right? And what is it? What is the entry that I'm interested in? So the max values from M I star, right? How would you do this?
Would you do like that column times, or that row times
Right.
every column in the order matrix?
So it's the max over J, all J, Mij, and what was this?
Yeah, that row times all the columns.
Of V,
Yeah.
right? So that's what you're doing. And this is the basic operation that we're doing. What is the cost of doing this? What is the cost of doing just one of these? Just computing Ij. D, right? There are D entries, so each of your rows and columns of U and V are of size D, right? So you're doing D computations, the order D, for each of them, right? And so when you do something like this, it gets multiplied by each item. Okay. So just understand in terms of, again, this is not very tricky stuff, but you should understand. So going back to this, how good an estimate is Mij versus this product that we are computing. This is an inner product, right? So what is the comparison? How would you say? What is a good measure?
Very equivalent.
Are they? Can we
In
make?
terms of like what are we trying to measure?
We're not trying to measure. I'm trying to take M, a matrix, and approximate it by this product, right? So this is going to give me some approximation to Mij. It's not going to return Mij in all cases, right? This is one of you mentioned least squares. It's a fit. You're trying to fit something to your data, and the dimensionality of this thing is much smaller than the real one, so we might not get it. Secondly, we are missing data as well. So what would be a measure of this? So that how close these are, right? So I can write it as Mij minus this, let's call it Ui star V star J, right? This difference gives me a value, and maybe you want to take the square of that over all values and take the square root of this. Okay? This, in the standard sense, over all ij's is going to be the Frobenius norm. That's all. So, right? So think in terms of an intuitive feel, what we are trying to do, think in terms of what it means mathematically. Okay? It's not exactly the Frobenius norm though. Why? Why is it not the Frobenius norm? I just sort of did everything and told you it's the Frobenius norm. Now I'm asking you, why is it not exactly the Frobenius norm? Why? That expression is actually the Frobenius norm, but there's something a little bit wrong there. Think now, get back to the specific problem.
Some of the values could be blank.
They are, exactly. So we're not computing the sum because I don't know this in places. So this is only over values of where Mij exists in M. Right? So for all Mij in M. Okay? So again, distinguish between the mathematical, intuitive, and the problem specific aspects that we have to deal with. Is this clear to everybody?
So you actually don't take the assume it to be 0.
Which one?
So M, if
Yeah.
you don't have n take the matrix, you don't assume it to be 0.
in this case. So again, this is how you would adjust it. So it's probably, again, this is where the difference is, right? You can solve the same problem assuming that they're all zeros, and you will actually do certain tricks to make sure that 0 is not a bad choice. But when you're optimizing, eventually you're going to optimize this function. We're also going to, this is the same way we're going to measure how good our fit is. And that's only going to be for the values where we have, so to say, the ground truth. Right?
Because in that case, I mean, otherwise it will be minus u. I mean, it's whether or not you're adding the term negative minus ui vj squared in cases where that entry is present or not.
Yes.
I mean, that might bias your whole.
It will. That's why we don't add it, right?
Oh.
So this our similarity and what we optimize is only. It's a Frobenius norm, but defined only in places where data is present, right? So you're going to skip everything else. So if I don't have Mij, then I don't actually count that in my similarity. And this is an important factor, right? You'll see that even when we do our derivations eventually, we're going to sort of work with this, but understand that this expression and everything else that we use is only where Mij is defined. We completely skip our data points everywhere else. Okay? Is this clear? It's not a very difficult concept, but you need to appreciate that that's happening out there. And that's why I said it's basically overall